Hello and welcome to Since Attlee Churchill, the podcast about British political history since the Second World War. I'm Lee Evans, a historian of the Conservative Party.
And I'm Richard Johnson, a historian of the Labour Party, and Lee's husband. In each midweek episode, we will be marvelling at glorious pearls of contemporary British political interest.
Just before we get going this week, just to say that if you enjoyed listening to our Easter Sunday episode about the religious faith of Harold Macmillan and Tony Blair, there is a special bonus episode on our Patreon looking at the religious lives of two other Prime Ministers, Margaret Thatcher and Gordon Brown. There's a link to the Patreon in the show notes where you can find that bonus episode. In this midweek episode, we always look at something which has caught our eye or piqued our curiosity in the previous week. I wanted to talk about something that actually really annoyed me over the Easter weekend, and it was attacks on the King's faith and Christianity by some people on the right, what we may call the alt-right. Some people might call them the hard right, the far right. In this instance, at least, they were the deluded right. It all seemed to begin with a hullabaloo about whether or not the King was, quote-unquote, cancelling the Easter broadcast that some people imagine that the monarch did every Easter, and then contrasting that with the observation that the King had done a special broadcast to the Muslim community for Ramadan. Now, as a point of fact, pretty much everything that I've just summarised there is untrue. The King did not do a broadcast for Ramadan. There was a video from during the pandemic that he recorded as Prince of Wales, nor is there some tradition of the monarch doing an Easter broadcast. Of course, there's the Christmas message, 3:00 every year on Christmas Day from the sovereign, but there's no Easter tradition. The Queen did it once in her very long reign. The King has put out a message in the past, but didn't do it this year. This set light to the kindling for a certain group of people, particularly on the right, about whether or not, let's dismiss to begin with the most absurd one, some people suggesting that the King is somehow secretly a Muslim and has gone against his coronation oaths to uphold the Church of England and the Church of Scotland. Ludicrous, just clearly, obviously, nonsensical, ludicrous. The King is very clearly a deeply thoughtful Christian man. He attends church very regularly, something that cannot always be said for his critics on matters of religion. He is deeply interested in church history and also alternative churches within Christianity, including the Orthodox Church. Of course, there's that patrilineal connection to Greece and the Greek Orthodox Church, which quite clearly is a point of interest for the King. He has at Highgrove, his personal house in Gloucestershire, a special retreat, a little building, which was blessed by the Lord Charterist, the former Bishop of London, which the King apparently uses for private moments of contemplation, where he is thinking about faith and matters of Christianity. I think there is no doubt at all that the King is a sincere, believing Christian who takes his role as Supreme Governor of the Church of England incredibly seriously. So why is it that some people chose to stoke up this controversy about an apparently missing Easter message this particular year? Well, I think there are three things that I wanted to touch upon. One of them is that I think there is an emergent Christian nationalism from some people on the right in particular who resent the King's engagement and respect for other faiths, especially Islam, I think it's worth saying. The King as head of state for a country that, if we're honest with ourselves, and I'm a member of the Church of England, I believe in the core tenets of the Christian message, but if we're honest with ourselves, that is a declining opinion among people in this country. We are an increasingly secular nation. A lot of people no longer believe in God, let alone the Christian interpretation of God. And the King as head of state clearly sees himself as having some obligation, particularly to the other faiths that are in the United Kingdom, and has to reconcile this position as Supreme Governor of the Church, the established Church, the Christian Church of England that we have in this country, with also being head of state for non-Christians. That means that he has a broadly ecumenical and inclusive way of considering faith, which I happen to think is correct, but clearly angers some people. That feeds into what I think is a perennial but highly damaging trend that you get among some people on the right, which is to basically adopt this extreme radicalism that sees inherited institutions as not meeting their standard of what they wish they ought to be or what they believe they may have been in the past, and therefore they end up wanting to destroy them. This is a slightly more general trend, it's worth saying. You see it in one sense with those who will not try and argue for their version of politics within the Conservative Party, but instead decide that even though they may agree with it on the vast majority of things, it has to be destroyed and Reform UK or whatever has to take its place. That is a unconservative argument, really, that an old political party in this country cannot be changed or revived or influenced, but must just be destroyed and something else take its place. You see it now with other institutions, people who would like to attack the BBC and others, and you see it now even for some of these radical people of the right who really oughtn't use the word conservative to describe themselves. You see it even with the monarchy, one of the oldest, most important, and most sacred institutions in our country. Thirdly, I think we now have, and this is enabled by social media, people for whom ranting about things is not only on occasions profitable, but often for everybody easy. Now, it's very easy to do a tweet about the decline of Christianity in this country, or some bizarre conspiracy about the king's lack of faith or belief in an alternative religion. What's harder is to actually walk the hard yards of helping maintain the Christian tradition in the UK. There was a superb piece in The Critic this week by Bijan Omrani, and in this piece he basically said, you've got to be and support the church that you want to see in this country. That if you actually want Britain to maintain its Christian tradition, to have a living church that is active in every village and hamlet and town and city, you get it by, first of all, going to church, by, if you've got skills, volunteering, if you can help clean the church, prepare the flowers, assist the church council with managing the affairs of that parish or that benefice, supporting them when they say have to apply for heritage grants, if that's something you've got specialism in. He lists this tremendous number of ways in which churches actually need people to help them function and survive and even thrive in the modern world. And there is clearly a battalion of keyboard warriors who are not particularly interested in that, but are interested in trying to project an image of themselves as the defenders of Christian Britain, whilst actually attacking the king, who is himself one of the great defenders of the Christian tradition and Christian heritage in this country, and simply trying to undermine the institutions that we have in this country. That is a bit of a rant, I concede, but it actually really annoyed me over Easter because I thought it was so deplorable, contemptible, lamentable what some people were saying on the right. And it is the exact opposite to what Christianity in this country actually needs.
Well, I understand your frustration and anger there, Lee, in the sense that I think you're basically correct. This is a very strange conspiracy that's been thought up that the king is somehow secretly Muslim or somehow not Christian. This, to me, sits in the same category as a recent conspiracy that was going around on social media and on GB News that the Fabian Society is secretly running Britain. If anyone knows anything about the Fabian Society today, I don't mean to be unkind. I know there are some committed Fabians. I think its defining characteristic is its ineffectual nature rather than the idea that it's pulling the strings behind this government. That being said, for the purposes of a bit of discussion on this topic, let me try to sketch out what I think is a somewhat less conspiratorial argument, not necessarily one that I myself share, but I think where perhaps the more serious people on the other side of this discussion might sit, if they sit there at all. And that is about what you talked about in your rant presentation. It was better than a rant. the conflict the king faces between his position as the supreme governor of the Church of England and his desire to recognize that Britain is a multi-faith society, that the Commonwealth is a multi-faith organization, and that the king wishes to be tolerant and ecumenical as the head of the Commonwealth and as the head of the head of state, in addition to his role as being head of a particular confession, the Church of England. That is a very difficult dilemma to face. I think the king's critics would argue that the king perhaps slides a bit too much into the ecumenicalism insofar as it almost becomes a kind of theological relativism, the kind of view of faith that basically it doesn't matter what anyone believes, as long as you believe in something, and actually even if you don't believe in anything, that's okay as well. We follow our own paths and journeys, and we pursue our own paths of enlightenment. I think that's actually a perfectly valid viewpoint to take about faith and the nature of faith. But I think the king's critics might say that as the supreme governor of a particular Christian confession, he needs to be a bit more proactive in making the case for his particular faith and not to simply present it as just simply one of an equal set of different religious approaches. Kemi Badenoch, although I don't think has weighed into this discussion, has quite often talked about the dangers of moral relativism. She has stated that she does not believe that all cultures are morally equivalent, that she has said that there are certain cultural practices and cultures that we should feel free to say are worse than our own. I think that's a much stronger positioning than the king himself has or would be prepared to make. And again, I think trying to sketch out what I think the king's best critics might say, this is in the face of certain religions that are much less apologetic about the superiority of their religious faith than others. And in the face of other religions saying that they are superior or better or the only true faith contra Protestant Christianity, maybe it's not so bad for a Protestant Christian to actually make a countervailing argument on behalf of their own faith. I'm not saying that is my view, but I think that's probably putting aside the bulk of actors on this side who are either acting in poor faith or with, I think, incomplete information. You've corrected the record on many of these things. I think that's probably where the most serious of those critics might sit. So I don't know what you have to say to that.
Well, certainly it is a dilemma faced by the king, this dual positioning, as we've both mentioned, between supreme governor of the church and head of state, and as you've correctly added to that, head of state not just of the United Kingdom, but of other realms and territories, and also the head of the Commonwealth as well. Quite obviously, it's the same dilemma that was faced by his mother, the late Queen. And one of the things that a lot of his critics seem to have adopted is this view that the more embracing approach that the king takes isn't the one that his mother would have taken. Well, quite clearly, they never listened to any of her Christmas messages, really from over the years or the last few decades in particular, because she clearly faced the same dilemma, and she clearly embraced a version of multiculturalism and multi-faith Britain, in which you engaged with other faiths and respected them as well, because it is really a key part of being the figurehead for the entire nation. The second thing I would say to it is that the king is not Pope. Sometimes when people approach these issues, they almost expect the king not just to be supreme governor, i.e. to have this essential role in protecting the status of the Church of England. They almost expect him to be Archbishop of Canterbury as well. Well, that's not really his role. That's not really his function. We have an Archbishop of Canterbury, a new one, to whom people can turn for religious instruction. They don't need the monarch for that. And in fact, in every city, town, village in this country, there are also vicars, parish priests, and all the rest of it who people can turn to for religious instruction. The king is there to symbolize the importance of the Church of England, which he does in a way which clearly for a lot of people is not especially interesting. It's not as interesting as tweeting out that the king is a Muslim. But actually, the day before this whole thing kicked off, he was doing the Maundy Thursday service. Well, actually, a lot of these people just didn't take an interest in that. But what was it? He was going to a cathedral. He was doing the tradition, a very old tradition in this country, of giving out the Maundy money. And people ought to pay more attention to those things. I mean, to wrap up some of my thoughts on this, I wanted to share a couple of views on why did some people on the right, and for new listeners in particular, I should say I think of myself as being on the right. Richard thinks of himself as being on the left. I think of myself as being on the right. I very much see myself as being in the conservative tradition as it exists in this country. But why have some people on the right basically, in my view, gone mad about this? Well, I have a few thoughts. One of them being that there are clearly, as there have always been of every generation and of every ideology, there are clearly some people who are just grifters. And extreme positions attract attention. And attention is, particularly in the modern age, a monetizable asset. You know, if you can put out tweets that really click with the algorithm and assert themselves in people's timeline, that is a very valuable thing to have. I actually genuinely think there were some just deeply unserious people who engaged on the back of this and did it for attention. Secondly, and rather more substantively, we are in an age of, in some ways, increasing splinter political projects, which require running to more, you could put it this way, extreme or distinct political positionings. So, of course, if you just take the right, it's not exclusive to the right, this, but if you take the right, you have the Conservative Party and then Reform trying to outflank the Conservative Party, and now Restore, there's Rupert Lowe outfit, such as it is, trying to outflank Reform. Alongside that, you have other eccentric fringe groups of the right to try and consider themselves as political parties, and when really they've not got the weight or the clout to do so. And it all depends upon really distinguishing your party from another. And sometimes that means you have to run to some, quite frankly, a mad position to get noticed. And I think that's partly what goes on sometimes within the debate on both wings of the spectrum, particularly in the social media age. And thirdly, and finally, I think among some people, there is now this utterly doom-laden view among some people on the right, where they think Britain is so broken being the word that's often used, that almost nothing is actually worth saving about this country. These are often people who I think pitch themselves as patriots, but somehow don't find anything they actually really like about this country. What they like seems to be abstract or historical, but often never actually existing in the way they sometimes think. So they almost just now see themselves as trying to destroy much of what is the institutional, civil, governmental framework of this country, which we've had for centuries, because they think it is irredeemable. And for some of those people, the monarchy is now a part of it.
On a much more trivial point, do you agree, Lee, that there is something rather peculiar in this expectation that public officials, public organizations, indeed corporate entities of any kind, are expected to deliver well wishes on every holiday and religious festival going? On the one hand, I can understand why it's done. It's a nice thing. People might feel recognized, seen, included, etc. I see that. But on the other hand, do we really need every MP to wish us? I mean, I think I saw some wishing you a happy Good Friday. I mean, Good Friday is not a happy day. It's not really the spirit of the day. Maybe it doesn't really matter. As I said, it's a bit of a trivial point. But is there a problem with this sort of sense that any entity with a public-facing role has to declare some kind of statement or celebration for every kind of holiday or festival, secular or religious?
Two thoughts occurred to me as you were asking that. One of them is that I think in part it's just the product of being an attention economy. Now that corporations always want to be tweeting stuff out from their social media and PR teams. And of course, every religious holiday, every day for one thing or another gives them the opportunity to do that and be seen. Where I think it feeds into a narrative that some people then exploit is that if you are, as this country is, formally and for many people still in practice too, a Christian country, then you would have lots of organizations, entities, the government, MPs, corporations, parish councils, whatever, sending people good wishes on Christian holidays. But then if you become a slightly more secular country or a more multi-faith country, then people say perfectly reasonably, and I have it to think correctly, well, we should include other good wishes with people of other faiths in that as well. So you might wish people happy Eid, or you might put out a message for Hanukkah, or for whichever religion it may be. And then, of course, by the time you add up all of the non-Christian religions, if you do Jewish events, Muslim events, Hindu events, Sikh events, and so on, and then you do Christian events as well, then it can feed into this sense that Christianity is a maligned or sidelined or marginalized religion within this country. It doesn't mean that that is the case, but I think just the volume of other religions can lend itself to that framing if people wish to exploit it. But I would always return to the point that the strength of Christianity in this country is based on the people who go to church, get involved in it, who believe, not on what may come from a member of Parliament's Twitter account. Richard, what's your matter of interest this week?
Well, in our most recent Sunday episode, where we discussed the faith of Harold Macmillan and Tony Blair, some listeners commented, I think rather bristlingly, that I had described Tony Blair rather uncritically in the episode as a Christian socialist, with the question mark more over the socialist than the Christian part of it, although I think some also put a question mark over the Christian element. And so this led me to think that my matter of interest this week would be to expand upon the question, was Tony Blair a socialist? I think to many listeners, except perhaps those on the furthest right, when they think of Tony Blair, they do not think of a red flag waving socialist. And I think especially for people on the left, to think of Tony Blair as a socialist feels odd or wrong or even a derisory concept. How can a man who made his peace with Margaret Thatcher's privatization and deregulation regard himself as a socialist? How can a man who changed Clause 4 of the Labour Party to strip out the references to public ownership of the means of production, distribution, and exchange call himself a socialist? How can a man who spent his time cuddling up with media moguls and rich people in the city and elsewhere call himself a socialist? How could a man who himself has become very rich since leaving Downing Street also call himself a socialist? And I have to say that on the face of it, that has generally been my view. I'm not a Blairite. I've never been a Blairite and never been a fan of Tony Blair. Although I have to say, in my older age, I've grown to be perhaps more nuanced in my views of Blair than when I was a teenager when he was Prime Minister. But I think actually part of the problem here, well, not the problem, but I think part of the explanation for that visceral reaction against seeing Blair as a socialist is that most of us today see socialism primarily in economic terms. Socialism is seen as supporting an economic system in which the rich are heavily taxed, and that money is then used to provide welfare and social services to the poor. And the goal of a social society is to use the state, in effect, to ensure that everyone basically has the same. Now, I may be caricaturing that a bit, but I think that is basically the man or woman on the street view of socialism, if you ask them what it is today. And I think that even for those of us who might think about politics a bit more than the median person on the street, that is probably the go-to kind of core reference point about socialism. But in the history of Britain, there is a tradition of socialism which is very distant from economics or even from the state. At the start of the 20th century, for many people in the Labour Party, socialism was really a question about ethics and morality. It was about a way in which people lived their lives in relationship to other people. It was about living a social life rather than an individual life. It was about living a life where you regarded everyone around you and further afield as your moral equal, where you treated everyone as morally equal to yourself. You showed this through individual acts of charity and mercy and kindness. But whether the state was responsible for compelling that kind of behavior was actually on the British left somewhat more controversial. And the idea that any of that had anything particularly to do with questions about the ownership of industry or about the tax system or about the labor market and so on was more controversial still. And this was true both on the left and the right of the Labour Party. Ramsay MacDonald, the first Labour Prime Minister, came from the left of the Labour Party. He's remembered now as someone who betrayed the Labour Party, who sold out to the right, who went in with a Conservative government. But actually, I think part of that is because we view the MacDonald leadership through that more economistic framework of socialism. And in that framework, both Ramsay MacDonald and his Chancellor Snowdon, who also jumped ship to the national government in 1931, are viewed as subscribing to a highly orthodox, liberal, in the sense of a small state view of economic management. But for people like MacDonald and Snowdon, they were very deeply committed socialists. I mean, I think some of the most beautiful writing about socialism in Britain was written by Ramsay MacDonald. And I don't think that's because MacDonald was a liar or a hypocrite. I think it was because for MacDonald, socialism for him was that ethical tradition. When he was Labour leader, he was fiercely against Labour supporting minimum wage. And he said, socialism is not going to come about by the legal declaration of a minimum nominal wage. Because for him, for MacDonald, socialism was actually a question of moral conversion in the same way that for some people, Christianity is a question of moral conversion. Of course, the state can mandate everyone to be a Christian. Of course, the state can use the law to force people to behave according to Christian doctrine. But many Christians would see that as actually offensive. And that really what Christianity is about people coming to the faith and living their lives according to the faith. And that analogy to socialism, ethical socialism, is not actually a very far one to make at all, because of course the British tradition of ethical socialism comes very much out of Christianity.
I'll be honest, I don't buy it at all. And a couple of reasons why I'm not convinced. First of all, there's a question of how do these ideas, this supposed Christian or socialist ethic that people like MacDonald subscribe to, how does it become a political program? Because realistically, what we're talking about here is not just local do-gooders, no matter how much good they may do. We're talking about people who aspire to wield political power. That's what Ramsay MacDonald did. That's what Tony Blair did. And if they're motivated by just this sense that people ought to be compassionate in their relations with one another, but that it is not for the state to compel them to do so, it's not at all clear, in fact, why they want to wield the power of the state in the first place. And certainly not how they could call themselves socialists as they do so. Secondly, on some of those points that you raise, I think it's important really to put it into the context. When the British state was a relatively small enterprise, largely focused on national defence, on war overseas, and perhaps levelling tariffs on corn or whatever the case sort of may be, and managing the growing empire at the time, I can see how you do not necessarily think that it is the role of the state to take over huge amounts of the income that people have and start redistributing it one way or another to create a more economically equal world. And therefore you could say, well, in fact, it's not for the state to do this from the position of the 19th century. It is instead for people to be converted to these principles. But by the time you're in the modern day, when we have a welfare state, In the view that you've set out, and I don't want to be sort of uncharitable towards people who may subscribe to this, you could call yourself a socialist on that basis and basically do away with the welfare state. Take an extreme libertarian view of the welfare state in government and say, well, it's not for the government to tell people that they have to be nice and charitable and compassionate and Christian towards one another. We are going to give them back their money and simply try and convince them that they ought to do so on an individual basis, not through political arguments about the state, but through arguments about what they ought to believe in their hearts. But if somebody did that, I would not willingly label them a socialist. And so, whilst I don't deny that there is this socialist ethic that people may have about treating each other equally and as with equal moral worth, which, for what it's worth, I happen to think has pretty much won. Almost everybody does accept that point, generally speaking. Very few people would dissent from that today. I think that is distinct from the question of what does a socialist political program look like.
Well, on the point about how do you convert people to socialism, well, I guess people in the early 20th century would have said, well, it is actually about going to the street corners and talking to people in the marketplaces. It's about writing publications and getting ideas out to people. It's about debating. It's also about inspiring people through the example of the life that you might live. That the purpose of elected labor officials in part is to provide a sense of moral leadership and direction for their proverbial flock, right? I mean, these things are all the analogies between ethical socialism and certain forms of particularly dissenting Christianity in the early 20th century. There's an enormous amount of overlap. And when it comes to what do you do when you get into power? Well, of course, that was part of the problem that people like MacDonald and Snowden faced, is they, in one sense, didn't seem to know exactly what they did want to do when they were in power. But this was not just some kind of right-wing conspiracy. This was across the board in the Labour Party. I mean, there's some amazing quotes from the debate on the minimum wage in the 1980s at the Labour conference, where one delegate, who happened to be a trade union delegate who was a member of the Communist Party, which was still allowed in those days, said that he believed that the minimum wage was a unrealistic measure for Labour to support, and really the focus of the Labour government should be bringing down capitalism. But I don't want to give the impression that they had no idea what to do when in government. I mean, there was a consensus that government should be used to try to alleviate suffering and to improve the conditions of those who are the worst off in society. The MacDonald government, even though it was a weak minority government, did make some gains in social housing, for example, in that government with the Weekly Housing Act. It was also a government that sought to, or Labour in that period, the ethical socialists believed that the purpose of government was also to remove impediments that people faced that maybe were marks historically of an inferior social status, and to try to, again, use the law to ensure that everyone was equally recognized under law. But actually, I think the thing that MacDonald saw the capture of state power to be the most important thing for him was to achieve world peace. And really, the thing that MacDonald was most interested in as prime minister was foreign affairs. Indeed, MacDonald appointed himself as his own foreign secretary in the 1924 government. And I think that leads us into Tony Blair, actually, because I think there are some parallels between Blair's ethical socialism and MacDonald's ethical socialism, particularly in that respect, although on the face of it, when I mention peace and Tony Blair, people don't always think of them going hand in glove. And I certainly understand that point.
That'll be the next theme of the complaining comments.
Was Tony Blair a peacemaker? I don't think he was. But for Tony Blair's part, he explicitly aligned himself with the ethical socialism tradition. Quite helpfully, for the purposes of this podcast, in 1994, Tony Blair wrote a Fabian pamphlet entitled Socialism by Tony Blair. It's not a great pamphlet, but in that pamphlet, Blair says that his socialism is ethical socialism. That's the term he uses, which he says sees socialism as, quote, a set of values and beliefs. He explicitly distinguishes this from what he calls the quasi-scientific view of socialism, which sees socialism in economic terms. So Blair understands this tradition and situates himself in the ethical tradition rather than the economistic tradition. What are those values? Well, there Blair is a bit fuzzier, it has to be said. He does say that those values include for him a belief in, quote, the equal worth of each citizen and a belief in community. He also says that it entails the belief that people are, quote, socially interdependent human beings, that individuals cannot be divorced from the society to which they belong. It is, if you will, socialism, end quote. This all might sound a bit fluffy and airy-fairy, but I suppose in some respects, at least on a superficial level, ethical socialism can sound that way, but perhaps also so can Christianity. And I don't mean that in a pejorative sense, but it's easy to just talk in broad brush terms about Christianity to make it sound like everything's really simple and easy as well. And as we talked about in the Sunday episode, I think that Blair's ethical socialism and Christianity really are hand in glove for him. Indeed, he writes in his memoirs that he came to religion and his politics at the same time when he was at Oxford under the informal tutelage of the Anglican vicar, the Reverend Peter Thompson. And you can see that when Blair is talking about his Christianity, it also sounds sometimes very similar to his politics. In 1992, when John Smith was elected leader, Tony Blair addressed the Christian socialist movement and said, "We are trying to establish in the public mind the coincidence of democratic socialism and Christianity. There is a desire in the Labour Party to rediscover its ethical values, the ethical code that most of us really believe gave birth to the Labour Party." The following year, he wrote a foreword for a book in which he said, "Christianity is a very tough religion. It places a duty, an imperative on us to reach our better self and to care about creating a better community to live in. It is judgmental. There is right and wrong. There is good and bad, and we should not hesitate to make such judgments." And in that respect, you can see something of maybe Blair's tough on crime approach when he was Labour leader. That same year as the year in which he, as Shadow Home Secretary, spoke in really quite strong moral terms after the murder of the little Liverpool boy, Jamie Bolger. And Blair said that there is something very wrong as a society if people cannot see what is so obviously right from what is so obviously wrong. When he was Prime Minister, as we talked about in the episode on Sunday, he didn't speak in quite as explicitly Christian terms as he did when he was a front bench opposition figure. But there are clues of this where, for example, in 2000, he gives a lecture at Tübingen University in Germany on global ethics. And he says there are two key global ethical principles: belief in community and the equal worth of all. And therefore, I think for him, Blair's Christianity and his socialism most clearly crystallized when it came to foreign policy. Now, for Ramsay MacDonald, that was in effect a kind of pacifism in his foreign policy and a desire to support peace in the world. MacDonald is the British Prime Minister who recognizes the Soviet Union for the first time and so on. For Blair, it manifests itself, I think, in its liberal interventionism, where Blair believes that there is right and wrong, there is good and evil in the world, and that if you have power, as he did as British Prime Minister, you stand up for good against evil. And well, people can question and criticize Blair's judgment as to what was good and evil, but Blair would see genocide in Kosovo against the Kosovar Muslim population by the Serbian Christians as an evil act that he wanted NATO to stop. He saw the killing of Kurds in Iraq as a moral evil and believed that Saddam Hussein was on the side of evil and that he should be removed as a result of that. And so I think we have to take Blair actually at his word here, that when he said, for example, in that famous 1996 Easter interview with the Sunday Telegraph, where he talks a great deal about Christianity, and he says that in his view, Christianity stresses the value of community, not the narrow view of self-interest. The Christian stress on man's relationship, not only with God, but his fellow man, is, quote, the essential reason why I am on the left rather than on the right. I think we have to see that Blair is someone who situates himself in that ethical socialist tradition. And one might think that he doesn't mean that he's left-wing enough, but actually maybe there is something about ethical socialism defies left and right. And again, is it much more about how one views good and evil, one's relationship to other people in the community, not just locally, but as Blair would see it, as a human community.
I have a great admiration and respect for the ethical socialist tradition that you describe, but my issues with it remain that I don't think being an ethical socialist is sufficient to make you a socialist. So for that reason, I don't think Blair is a socialist. And I think if he is, then I think the substance of socialism is basically diluted to the point that it applies to, in some ways, almost anybody. I mean, if we take just briefly that point about social interdependence, of course, there are lots of ways in which we can think of people depending upon one another in lots of ways that can be on an individual to individual basis. When you see people in need, it can be through charities. And of course, it can also be through the state, in large part because of what more robust socialists, as I would describe it, than Blair, have given us as the framework for governance in the United Kingdom. So the poor are dependent upon the rich, paying their taxes. And in turn, the state provides a stable society in which rich people find that what they've got left is broadly protected, and poor people get the benefit of the redistribution that comes through the state. Now, that is a form of social interdependence enabled by the state, which isn't necessarily even socialist. I mean, I believe in that. And therefore, I don't think even the state acting in that sense can be a distinguishing enough feature of a political creed to say that it meets the criteria of socialism. I do think it has to be more active for the state. Although I concede, as I say, that this idea of ethical socialism it's very noble, it's very nice, it's very compelling, but I'm not convinced it's an actual political program.
I think I should also just acknowledge the point that some critics have made in response to the previous episode about the fact that once Blair left the premiership, he went off and was a consultant for very dubious governments and private sector actors, that he became very rich. These are not the actions that one would associate with socialism. And, again, I'm not here to be Tony Blair's defense shield, but I suppose if Tony Blair were to defend himself against those accusations, he would argue that he was raising that money to support entities, i.e., the Tony Blair Faith Foundation and the Tony Blair Institute for Global Change, which he would argue would do more good in the world than the perhaps dodgy stuff that he had to do to get the money in the first place. And so Blair's Christianity and socialism, if we're willing to accept those descriptors, are very much more about action, somewhat pragmatic in their nature, rather than about doctrine or theory or purity in those respects. And so I think Blair would argue that they're not inconsistent with his socialism, although I accept that many people would view them to be so.
Anyway, we could go on forever, but that's all for this midweek episode of Since Attlee and Churchill. We're approaching 100 episodes of the podcast, and happily, it's now being played across all different platforms more than 250,000 times, which we've been really delighted by. If you've enjoyed listening to the podcast, we'd be thrilled if you left us a positive review wherever you get your podcasts from. And if you're keen to hear more from us or listen to the podcast ad-free, you can join our Patreon. There are bonus episodes there, and it's also a great way just to support the podcast and keep Since Attlee and Churchill going. We'll be back on Sunday with our next deep dive into another topic in post-war British political history. We'll see you then.
Thanks very much.